Hey, Abby, how are you?
Hi, Yusuf.
How's
Hey, Abhay,
everything?
how are you?
Hi, Tariq. Hi, Yusuf. How are you?
We're
Good, good.
very good, thank you. Thanks for joining us. So we we can get started if you like.
Yeah, happy to get started whenever. So, just the video's fine. Everything's good.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay, Abby, welcome to the Anti-Racism Podcast, Islam Unraveled, where we come across the intersection of social justice, anti-racism, the environment, and many other topics that are compelling for today. And we're really eager to talk to you about your experience as a leader in environmental issues. And the climate emergency is an emergency. It is an emergency. And I just saw a meme from Greta Thunberg. If we don't do something about it, we are effed. So she's very eloquent. And so that in that being the case, now please talk about yourself and your journey to understanding and being passionate about this cause, and what influenced you, and role models that brought you to an understanding that work needed to be done by yourself and family members in this specific important existential threat to humanity.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's great to be able to talk about this important issue on a platform where we can really have a candid dialogue about what we can all do to make a difference for this. So, yeah, it's great to be here. My name is Abhay, and my passion in this field of environmentalism and climate activism really stems from my personal experiences. So I've grown up here in BC, and I've really loved the beauty of the nature around us. And I think that's always captivated me, just being able to take this beautiful environment, whether it's the mountains or the water or the fresh air, for granted. And I think a lot of us really don't reflect on what a privilege it is to be able to have all of these things that are so beautiful and so wonderful for us. So I remember for me just traveling around the world. So going to India for the first time. Although I was born in India, I was only 11 months old when I moved to Canada with my family. So no recollection of that. And when I was in India when I was 6 years old, I just remember seeing pollution for the first time, seeing garbage on the street, or a completely different way of looking at the world for me came in at that point. And so when I came back, I was very fascinated by climate change, and I began to learn more about it in school. So when I was in elementary school, I organized very simple things like recycling campaigns and climate change education campaigns. And so I continued that when I was in high school. I did presentations to elementary school students to try to get them involved. And a lot of that was about leadership development again. How can we get young students to learn what climate change is, not just for the sake of action, though, but for the sake of developing better leaders and developing people that can actually think critically, people that can understand issues and communicate with people. And so all of that led to this experience in 2016 when I actually received a scholarship from the United States Embassy to take part in this expedition called Students on Ice. And so Students on Ice is a foundation that does trips to the Arctic and Antarctic every single year. And so if you think about that for a second, it's incredible. They're taking students from around the world to the polar regions to learn about climate change, to learn about indigenous issues, to learn about all these different things and how they connect with each other. And so for me at that time, I was only 14 years old. I was able to see climate change firsthand. So the first day we were on our ship in the Arctic, we saw 9 polar bears.
Wow.
And as we go through this experience, I'm seeing glaciers calving in front of my eyes. I'm seeing ice melting. But beyond that, what I really learned was how climate change is impacting real people. And that was kind of the main point where things changed for me. I realized that climate change is not just an issue about plants and animals and the future, because we often hear climate change talked about as an issue of, a degree change and how weather patterns will change in the future. But it can be harder for us to understand how climate change is impacting us all today. And at that young age, I wondered why I wasn't learning about these communities that are in Canada that are still being impacted by climate change and have been for the past 20, 30 years. And so that was really the big reason that I started to care a lot more
Sorry, Abhay, there was a glitch. It just
Sorry.
kind of was a
Yeah.
pause, but now it's better. Please go ahead. We'll edit this out.
Okay. Where did I leave off?
So you were talking about how climate change impacts the real world, and
Yeah.
Abhay, in one example you gave in our previous discussion, where indigenous peoples, Inuit peoples, that for generations would be able to hunt and walk on ice and do their ice fishing and seal hunting, and because of climate change now, those norms are no longer the case. Please talk about that.
Absolutely. And I think that's such a big issue. So that was one thing that I learned about being in the Arctic and talking to my new friends. I learned that for generations and for thousands of years, Inuit peoples have gone hunting, have gone out onto the ice, and they've known the weather patterns. They understand when the ice is stable, they understand migratory patterns. And so for them, it's not a dangerous thing. But as of recently, because of climate change, because the sea ice patterns have changed so much, people are going out to go hunting, to go onto the sea, but the ice is breaking under them. The ice is just, it's not stable enough. And that is one of the direct consequences of climate change that we're seeing in present reality. So again, it's not really an abstract issue anymore. It's real people that are being impacted by this very concrete issue. And so it's resulting in injuries and death even. And that's just one small example of how this big issue of climate change has an effect on many people.
And like you said, that certain times of the year, it's understood that when the hunters go for fishing or seal hunting, that they can walk on the
Yeah,
ice, and because those norms are no longer the case, as you mentioned, if they fall through the ice, they will die. And historically, generationally, that wasn't the case because the weather patterns were a different way, and now they're completely different and affecting people's lives in a very, very real way.
absolutely. And I think on that point, you know, so some of us might think, well, why don't they just adapt their ways? The problem with that thinking is that these are customs and traditions, and this is knowledge that has been very local and very specific to that climate for thousands of years. We're not talking about 10 or 20 years of knowledge. This is thousands of years of knowledge that has been passed down. So what this is showing is that such a dramatic shift in climate change, or such a dramatic shift in climate, is having such large impacts on just this small community of people. Imagine what the consequences of climate change are for now the entire world, as everything that we know will change.
And even there are global statistics, 10, 20, 30 years, that the ocean levels will rise, certain countries will be flooded, coastlines will change, and many elements in overfishing and deforestation, so many things coming together. Now, there is one aspect of disinformation and climate deniers and critics, and yourself as a young leader, have you faced from your work criticism or deniers or folks that aren't convinced about the climate emergency?
That's a really good question. So I think, you know, to answer your question, I'll start with what you just mentioned about sea levels rising in the future. A lot of people don't really understand or have problems with the modeling that's currently in place. You know, models can be false, and someone might look at a model that certain countries will be underwater and say, well, that's not going to happen. But I think, again, what we need to do more effectively is communicate what is happening currently. There are actually countries that are underwater because of climate change. We're already seeing the sea level rise and we're seeing the impacts of it. We're seeing ocean acidification and what that's doing to coral reefs, for example. And uh, so to answer your question, uh, an example that I had with this is I was speaking at an event about the impacts of climate change on mental health of young people. And this was not too long ago. It was during the pandemic. And I remember someone commenting on a Facebook post somewhere saying, oh, well, why focus on this? This is not important at all. We need to focus on the pandemic and mental health. And if you think about where that person is coming from, perhaps there's some climate denial in there. There's some, there might be some idea that, oh, climate change isn't that serious of an issue. But if we look at what we can relate to, it's this idea that the pandemic is having impacts on mental health. And so, one thing that I've been thinking about is that this pandemic is a public health threat like no other. We haven't seen it in our lifetimes, any threat like this. And what I like to tell people is that climate change is an issue that's just as great, if not greater, of a public health threat. And we need to act in ways that can mitigate, that can reduce the harm that we'll see in the future. So, social distancing, for example, that's an example of something where we're limiting our contact so that we can have a better impact on everyone for the future. If we look at an issue like that, uh, in order to actually make a big change, we need to take some small actions now, and those will build up. And so, when we're speaking with climate deniers or people that may not understand the science of climate change, one thing that I've been really focused on is telling stories, understanding what we can do, understanding what's currently happening, and likening climate change to other things that we're going through. Because I think a lot of the disinformation that you talk about, you see something being passed around and you may not understand it. And so that's kind of that's the very, I guess it's the people with good faith and good intentions, people that want to live in a healthy environment, but they may not understand the information. And so my approach to tackling that is very different than tackling the approach to people who are actively trying to change the information out there and doing it with malicious intents. I think those with good intentions and bad intentions are very different in this space, and we need to address those concerns differently.
And that makes sense because there are people that are they aren't aware, they aren't educated, they don't understand what the issue is. They have other priorities, as you said. Some people say, well, COVID and mental health is more of a priority, but they don't understand the actual data of what's happening to the oceans and our terrestrial environment. And so how we connected was through the Starfish. And the Starfish, what I really like about your organization is that it's the 25 under 25 leadership against climate change and education and awareness about the climate emergency. How did you get on their radar, and how did you connect? And talk about that organization to give the context for the viewers and the listeners of the organizations that are involved to highlight leadership, youthful leadership in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. The Starfish Canada is a wonderful organization. And so the way that I got involved with them was my high school teacher actually nominated me to be a part of their top 25 environmentalists under the age of 25 list. And I think I was 15 or 16 at the time. He nominated me, and I was chosen to be one of Canada's top 25 under 25 for 2017. And in that process, I would say I really was able to connect with a lot of other young people that are doing climate work, that care about the environment. And I think the Starfish story is one that we've often heard. I think the story goes that there's someone on the beach and there's a pile of starfish that are on the sand. And there's this person who's throwing starfish into the ocean. There's thousands of starfish on the beach, and this person is just throwing one by one. And someone walks by and says, "Why are you doing this? You're never going to make a difference for all of them." But the person who's throwing the starfish throws another one into the water and says, "I made a difference for that one." And I think that story and that idea of youth empowerment, youth leadership, climate action, it's one that relates to us because it reminds us that we as individuals do have the power to take action. So often we think that we can't do anything, but the Starfish story tells us that even if we have an impact on one other person, whether it's through our speech or whether it's through our thinking or through our actions, that in itself is powerful. And the Starfish has been great for giving me this platform, for example, to connect with people like you so that we can have these conversations and create the change that we want to see.
And in terms of the team, which is across Canada, every diverse backgrounds, multiple cities across Canada, and connecting with other leaders like yourselves to feel that you're part of a cohesive tribe and a group that is all working on the same thing. How do you guys work together? How do you work in networking with your peers in the Starfish and also outside of the Starfish on climate and the climate emergency awareness initiatives?
Yeah, definitely. So my nonprofit, Break the Divide, through that, we're aimed at connecting young people with each other to break down divisions between communities. And one of those divisions that we often see is a division around climate knowledge. So the climate denial that you were talking about earlier, often misinformation, apathy about climate change, thinking that you can't do anything, for example. We've managed to create a few networks across Canada and the world now where young people are connecting with each other, learning about these issues from personal perspectives. The Starfish, it's been a wonderful network because I think when you bring people who have similar interests or similar passions, but come from very different backgrounds together, you're able to network with them, talk to them about how you can improve, what you can do better for the future, and collaborate along those bases. And I think networking, for that matter, is not so much about creating a connection for the sake of the connection, but it's for how can you support one another to do better work in the community.
And to even get inspiration from them, and they can be inspired by you and your work and duplicate it in their respective areas.
And so, absolutely, like one example that I think there is when we talk about climate apathy, the feeling that climate change is such a big issue that you can't do anything about it. One way to tackle that is to connect people who are feeling that way with people who are doing climate action, people who are taking action, so that you can be inspired by them and you can also want to work with them. So no, absolutely, I agree.
We've been speaking with government officials, and one of them saying it's like the time for education and awareness. The action needs to happen. So we have education and awareness that needs to keep going because, as you said, there are people maliciously working on disinformation, but the vast majority may or may not be fully aware and understanding and educated really about the magnitude of it, but the action, the education and awareness is needed and needs to be continuous, but the action. And in your view, what are the actions uh, where we can, within our context in Canada, to really help combat climate change?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and people are always asking this, like, what can I do about climate change? It's such a big issue, and we hear it being talked about more and more, but it ultimately goes back to that question, what can I do? And so I think there's two ways of looking at this. There's that individual level, but there's also the institutional level where, as an individual, you can have a greater effect on society. And so when I think of politics or institutions and organizations, I think we all have the ability to affect change there through the ways that where we spend our time, where we volunteer. All of that is very important, and I don't think that should be understated. On the individual level, though, I think, and of course, like not being a climate scientist or someone who knows the entire economics of climate change, I understand that it's complicated. But as an individual, there's little things that you can do that add up. And so we often hear about things like recycling, reducing our waste. Eating less meat is often something that's said to reduce our own carbon footprints. That is all important. And I think for me, one of the things of looking at these small actions, like driving less or biking more, taking public transit, like those things at an individual level may seem difficult and they may seem pointless. And I've struggled with that as well. But I think what is most powerful about those sorts of things is the ripple effect that it can have. So if you're able to inspire just one person, like we talked about earlier, then that in itself is so positive. If you're someone who makes sure that they're actually recycling properly, like I think sometimes we can not recycle properly and we say it's okay. But if you're someone who recycles properly and someone comes to your house and they see that, they might also want to recycle properly. And then that in itself can have that ripple effect. And again, it seems small and it may seem like you're not making that much of a difference on an individual level. But I think that's where we all have to start as individuals. And then by doing those small actions, then we can get involved in greater change and we can figure out how our own industries, how our own employment can fit into this broader narrative of climate change. So if you work in construction, for example, then you can see, well, what are ways that we can make our industry more sustainable? How can we reduce the carbon footprint of our industry? And so on that level, then as we look at the institutional level, I think there's so much economic change that needs to happen. Like we need to transform our energy system so that the and if you individual to do those little actions so that you can inspire others and start thinking about how you can create that greater change of that economic and social transformation. That in itself is such a positive step because now you're bringing people along the way for that positivity.
And there's the individual, and then there's teams and networks, and then there's government. And the previous podcast interview we had was with the Canadian Federal Minister Maria Monsef for Gender Equality and Rural Development. And when we brought up the topic of the environment, she mentioned Canada's goal is to be net zero by 2050, which is still a ways out. So net zero by 2050, but that's Canada. Then you have the United States. You mentioned India, and as you've traveled to a degree, and India itself is such a huge population compared to Canada. We have 38 million people over there, 1.3 billion people. So, just by sheer size and numbers, and populations like China and India really have a big effect on the world. Let's talk about we're local to global, and as you said with your organization break the divide, you have your local team, but you have an international network, and we have to work collectively as a global team. Let's talk about the global team and the global effort.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and I think again, to play that devil's advocate side, I think often we can say, well, Canada only contributes to less than 1% or 1.2% of global carbon emissions. So why should we change? Why should we destroy our economy? And you hear that sometimes to make this climate transition. But I think, again, there's also the economic and social arguments for this transformation at a national level. And I won't get into too much of the details, but essentially, it is better for us long term to make this economic transition to renewable energies now. And I'll leave it at that for that point. As we look at the global scale of things, and I'm very fascinated by this because I myself am a student of global health and peace, conflict, and justice. Uh, when we look at the big emitters like India and China and the United States, it can feel like again that our actions have no impact if India, China, and the United States continue to pollute. If the biggest emitters, these fossil fuel companies, continue to pollute, and I think that can be disheartening. But I think what we really need to keep an eye on is, again, not even the ripple effect of the individual now, but the ripple effect of innovations in the sector. So if the Canadian government or if the United States, with under the Biden administration now, is investing a lot in renewables, investing in cleaner tech, if that technology gets to this point where it is more affordable, if it's more efficient than the existing fossil fuels, then of course China and India will adopt it. And I think that's kind of the way that personally I've kind of began looking at the issue. It's that we need to look at it from an economic lens, absolutely, but we also have to look at those social costs of things like uh, fossil fuel pollution. So I think it's very complicated the way that the entire world comes together for this issue. Uh, but I think I think if we look at any other challenge that's happened in the world, the pandemic being a huge one, it was such a deep threat to all of us that we found a way to do it. I think the main argument here, and again, like we can talk about economics, but I'm not an economist. I'm not a climate scientist. That I understand though the necessity of this issue, and I think that where there's this, if there's a will to do this, there is a way. We must transform our systems as a global society, and I think those excuses that we're not able to do it are we can't we can't base our entire ideas on that. We need to be brave and innovative, and we need to tackle these with this curiosity about how we can be better, because this is a matter of life and death. This is a matter of how can we better our world, and I think we need to be positive and optimistic in that regard in order to create that change.
Absolutely. And you brought up the economic incentive. And what we've seen is leaders like Elon Musk and his company Tesla, which doesn't produce the amount of vehicles that General Motors or Volkswagen or any of these large car companies around the world, yet it's the most valuable car company in the world, and has influenced all these major car companies to start transitioning their fleets
Absolutely.
to electric. So one guy making an effort to show a business model can work and be profitable and can generate wealth has led the charge to be able to inspire others. Now, obviously, human beings have this desire, this economic gain incentive, and the green economy. As you said, some people think it may harm the economy, but there could be actually benefits to the green economy, evidenced by Elon Musk and electric cars. And as you mentioned, fossil fuels, that could be one element. But you brought up another point earlier about reducing our carbon footprint by eating less meat. And one of the biggest emitters, cattle production and meat. Let's talk about that, because a lot of people to eat vegetarian, which I've done because of the commitment to the environment and the understanding how beef and just the meat industry is really a high emissions sector, and it really the deforestation of rainforests and even what we have in North America is largely because of cattle production. But let's talk about those things, which could be innovations that can help incentivize people to change.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful point. I think that individual action of eating less meat, it's simple enough, and I think we can do it. Uh, and there's also like spiritual and religious arguments for it, that we ought to take care of our environment, and this is our personal duty to do so. I think the way that we look at the innovations in the sector too, we also need to look at the question of justice and equity as well. And so, if you're not able to afford these greener foods, which are often more expensive, vegetables can be more expensive, and you don't get enough protein per pound, for example, then that's where that systemic change needs to happen. So again, it's I think there's multiple ways of looking at this issue. It's very easy to say everyone should stop eating meat today. No, we're going to ban it, for example. But I don't think that's the solution. I think really need to change the systems that allow for people to access certain foods. And if we look at certain things like access to healthy foods in communities, food security is such a big issue, and that's being worsened by climate change. If we look at that issue, food security, then we're looking at ways that we can get people access to healthy and nutritious food. And in that regard, then, what are we doing in order to make these systems easier for people to access? And again, I'm kind of going in circles here now. I think what I'm trying to get at here is that, excuse me, instead of looking at that individual change in isolation, we need to look at the factors that result in people making the choices that they do. Are you eating meat because you've always eaten meat and it's just something you're used to? Are you eating meat because you don't have the finances to actually buy vegetables that are enough to support your family? Are you eating meat because it just feels good and you just enjoy it and you don't care about the environment? I think those are things that we need targeted solutions to, and addressing each of those in isolation or without looking at the core issues won't be as productive for our long-term goals.
And even innovators, they've come up with innovations like
Yeah,
Beyond Meat, and
yeah,
so that and it tastes. It's not quite meat, but it's pretty close. And Yves, their salami, their vegan salami is actually not bad. So there
yeah.
are scientists working on the economic incentive to provide certain meats that are not meat but taste like meat, and they are very successful businesses. So we're already starting to see that
Mm.
businesses that are responding to our environmental concerns are profiting enormously from providing alternatives to people with the social consciousness that we have to at least not sacrifice taste for and lifestyle for our environmental consciousness.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. I think again, I think we need to look at those systems and why are people eating meat? Is it because of the taste? Then you, like you said, these innovators are coming up with Beyond Meat so that we don't have to sacrifice that. And it's only going to get better and better.
And even economy wise, with the 3D printing and the ability for manufacturers to now, instead of offshore manufacturing, the carbon footprint of transportation and manufacturing, that all countries can in effect be their own manufacturing hubs with 3D printing to reduce that carbon footprint of transportation of goods, and create sustainable economies for the respective countries. So 3D printing and innovations in manufacturing and vertical farming to bring the farm closer to the plate, where even in cities to grow all these vegetables and fruits within our respective cities, so we don't necessarily have to rely on fruits and vegetables from hundreds and thousands of miles away, that it could be within our locality. So all these innovations with the profit incentive are coming. We just need to accelerate it. And
Absolutely. And I think, yeah, like I don't want to make it seem like everything's bad and the world is horrible. Like you amazingly brought up, there are all these innovations and these important things being done, and we're headed in a good direction. We need to continue to put the gas on the pedal, incentivize governments now to take these leaps of faith, or not even leaps of faith, because again, there are the economic reasons for this change. It's documented again and again in studies that if Canada transitions its economy to a greener economy now, we will be better off for later. We will support the workers in the process. We're not going to, leave them to the last minute and then have a huge fossil fuel subsidy or bailout, because right now we're subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. Like again, it's those kind of things that we don't often understand, we don't often see for a multitude of reasons. And one other point on that, I think it's so important, is that when we look at profit, who is the profit being brought to? And so there are some proponents that the entire system that we have is very faulty and we need to completely dismantle it. There's also people that say we only need to focus on profit and economic incentive. I at this current moment, I'm under the belief that the private sector collaborating with the public sector can result in innovations that can be beneficial to everyone. And I think when we look at something like vertical farming or Beyond Meat, those are examples of that. Those are examples of innovations getting to people, and the government and the public sector can support in getting that to everyone. I think though that when we look at profit, we need to change the way that we're looking at it from just profit for shareholders to profit to all stakeholders. How can we make entire communities better? And I go back to the economic analysis because people will say, well, that's going to result in less money. It'll be inefficient. But again, time and time again, it's been shown that when you invest in your community, when you invest in employees, not only is your bottom line better off, but you're better fit for the long term of this sort of production and future of your company too. So again, there's the entire societal way of looking at it as well.
And systemically, we talked about government and the Canadian government, possibly global governments, and it does require all of us to work together. We have government, we have private sector, we have academia, we have the media, and we have leaders like yourself that working in concert together and keeping our attitudes up in spite of the adversity and the obstacles that are in front of us from either climate deniers or special interests that have deep pockets lobbying against aggressive regulatory changes to their sectors. So those are important things to contend with, and we have to work on every level. Now, in terms of your kind of goals for the coming, let's say 1 to 5, 10 years with Break the Divide and with the networks that you've developed, what are your personal objectives and your objectives with Break the Divide?
Yeah, so Break the Divide, again, it's been a wonderful project I've been able to work on for the past few years. And I co-founded Break the Divide with my older brother, so it's very near and dear to my heart. And now we've gotten volunteers from all around the world supporting the work. One thing that we're doing now is we're actually hiring paid employees to take Break the Divide to the next level. To hire people to be able to create these programs for students to be able to connect with each other and learn about each other. That personalized learning is so important because it's so much better impacted by climate change, reading about it in a textbook. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do. So over the next few years, we really hope to develop specific programming based on certain issues. Sorry, did I cut out there? Good. Okay. Yeah,
And
you're muted.
sorry, we'll edit that. We got most of it. You should put a thumbs up.
Okay.
So
Oh,
so
perfect. Sorry.
so
It
now,
completely lagged on my end.
and in terms of getting some funding and employing people and building out your teams, and culture, and you talked about the intersection of social justice and other elements that are there, and this area of environmental racism as well, where certain policies governments will implement, toxic waste, wastewater treatment, other type of things that disproportionately affect lower income and people of color. And let's talk about environmental racism and the intersection of the environment and social justice and racism.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say it's such a major issue, and there's examples of it everywhere, from highways being built in America through in the middle of Black communities, predominantly Black communities, for the main purpose of separating them. I think we need to take a step back and look at the intentions behind a lot of these policies, which has been and is to discriminate against people. And in Canada, too, we look at pipelines and the impacts that they have on Indigenous communities. Oil spills can completely ruin not only the natural ecosystems, but result in harm to the health of people. And I think that's something that, again, is underlooked. Like, what is the impact of these actions on health? And I think health is something that over the past year, especially, we've all really come to cherish and care for. We need to care about the health of other people. And so, understanding these issues, again, from personal perspectives, I would say is quite powerful in order to be able to understand it and take action. We must, though, be vigilant and diligent about taking action on the issue of environmental racism, because it is very real. And I think explaining it in the concrete terms that you did, I think that's so important, to be able to ground it in reality, as opposed to, again, some abstract ideology that's hard to understand.
And you brought up highways. So we have in Vancouver the Georgia Viaduct, and Hogan's Alley was a predominantly Black community, majority Black community, which is where the Georgia Viaduct is today. And again, environmental racism in our backyard, where on purpose the government of that time completely displaced the Black community living there to make way for this Georgia Viaduct through their community. And
Yeah.
and so and
I find it interesting that often we see racism when it impacts our own communities. So, like,
yeah,
whether it's the South Asian community or
yeah.
the Chinese Canadian community, we can see those issues in our silos, but we can sometimes find it hard to understand those impacts on other communities. So, I mean, sometimes we can say, "Why? No, the government wouldn't do that. We have faith." But you look at instances like the Komagata Maru. That is an instance where the government purposefully denied people from coming to Canada. Why is it so out of our mind that they wouldn't do something like harm a community for a specific reason? And again, obviously these things are complicated. I'm not saying that they're not, but I think looking at the intentions and underlying reasons behind these issues is important, and it needs to be addressed in order to create solutions for the future.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you brought up the Komagata Maru, because when that happened, my great grandfather and grandfather were already here in Canada, in the United States, from Punjab as well, and they actually went to swim to bring food to the people on the Komagata Maru, because countrymen, regardless, like, we got to help the countrymen, and it was a tragic event in our South Asian history.
Yeah.
But now we're here 100 years later, and systemic racism has affected many communities. And now we talked a little bit about our First Nations community, and just literally today I saw a report where they found 215 bodies exhumed in Kamloops from a residential school because of the systemic discrimination against First Nations people. So our First Nations people, their tradition and their beliefs are that the actual forests and the mountains are like relatives, because when we die, our body becomes food for the forest, food for the animals, and becomes part of the ecosystem. So they view the environment as being relatives and being related to the environment and the ancestors, and they have this deep connection. Whereas we ourselves tend to think of family in terms of people and our tribe and our immediate family and our extended family, but that deeper feeling that we are part of the land physically. And I think that's a key distinction. And because of your experience with First Nations peoples, let's talk about reconciliation. Let's talk about how working with First Nations from these lands that understand these lands, and how we can learn from them rather than oppress them.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think as Canadians, we need to understand the dark history that Canada has. We can often overlook it, and understanding that cultural genocide has been committed against Indigenous peoples of Canada. That even the simplest things of children being removed from their parents, taken to schools where many of them died because of the abhorrent conditions. Many of them suffered so much abuse, and even now, because of that trauma, the trauma continues to persist within communities. And that is something that is so important to understand, because it informs of how we address the systems today. Even today, though, we look at education and First Nations reserves. Education is underfunded. Mental health is underfunded. And these are issues that we need to take action on today. Those are not problems of the future or yesterday. These are things that are impacting Indigenous peoples today. So I would say reconciliation is, often thought about as this idea of coexistence between different people. So coexistence between settlers of this land, and immigrants are included in settlers, and Indigenous peoples. And I think that is an important way of looking at it. That Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples need to come together and learn about one another. Or, as non-Indigenous peoples, we ought to understand Indigenous peoples and learn from them and learn from the land. That's so important, especially when we talk about addressing climate change, for example. That's where it comes together, because Indigenous knowledge is key to address climate change, and it's been shown time and time again. But I think one other aspect of truth and reconciliation really is that truth aspect. What is the truth of what has happened in Canada? And how do we get Canadians to understand that? That's something that we need to put more attention on. And the truth of what is going on reserves today, the truth of the issues that Indigenous peoples are facing because of the Canadian government and the colonial powers. Like, there are communities, and when I went to communities in the Arctic, and when my friends told me about their communities, I really saw how colonialism continues to impact Indigenous communities and people. And again, we talk about decolonization. I think that is also an important aspect of reconciliation. Learning the way that Indigenous peoples have lived, learning about their systems, their societies, and understanding and creating rooms, creating spaces for self-governance is also very important. And again, these are very deep concepts that I'm only beginning to understand. But my understanding is that learning about this all, talking about it, and pushing for action on the issues that exist today, that is truth and reconciliation.
Absolutely. And uh, racism is such a thing where marginalized communities that have been systematically been marginalized in many ways. And then if there are certain issues that they'll criticize the Black community, First Nations community, what people in that are white supremacist ideology tends to blame Indigenous peoples and Black people for their lot in life, whereas the systematic dismantling of culture, of neighborhoods, of families is ingrained in the system. And if there are issues that's apparent right now as a result of it, they're saying, oh, they're like that because that's the way it is. But that was a systematic dismantling of communities. And everyone has the right to respect. Everyone has the right to equal treatment and fairness and justice. And when that's being for one group over the other, that inequality is really what I think this reconciliation is all about: the inequality, the injustice, and to rectify that. And I think it's a big topic we're talking about, that a lot of folks are not aware of these injustices and the length of decades and hundreds of years of oppression have had their toll on our First Nations and our Black community.
Absolutely. And again, I think what you said there is we need to look at the root of why these problems exist, not just what they look like today, but the root of these issues. And again, like the question is asked as of recently, like, is the RCMP racist? Is the RCMP systemically racist? Is this institution systemically racist? But if we look at the roots of how these organizations are founded, the RCMP was created to displace Indigenous peoples from their land, to remove them from their land. And again, people can say, oh, well, it wasn't their land legally. Well, actually it was. And there are so many documents and treaties that show legal ownership. And, not to get into the weeds of that, but I think looking at the roots of organizations like the RCMP, no, I'm not saying that the RCMP is systemically racist or that Canada or everyone is racist. What I'm trying to say, though, is that we need to have discussions and be able to have these open discussions to look at the roots of these institutions today so that we can understand where they came from, why they exist, and how they contribute to problems that exist today.
And interesting, we had a presentation to one of the law enforcement agencies, and just casually they mentioned, oh, all the leadership is white Caucasian, by and large, white Caucasian. So if you grow up white Caucasian, you never experienced racism, it's very hard to understand the experience of a person from India or from Pakistan or from China or from a First Nations background or a Black background, what racism is. And I think there are people that will say, and I've heard this, there's no such thing as racism. It's not true. And then they're like, well, you've never been called a derogatory name, because of your ethnic background, the color of your skin. And so because they have never had that experience and that systemized inequality, it's hard for them to understand. And it's almost like explaining the sky is blue, and they don't necessarily understand. So we are dealing with a system which that has never experienced that level of oppression or racism or discrimination because of their color, because of their names, because of their religion, and because of that, that's one divide. So break the divide is to break the divide of this misunderstanding where people literally can't see the other person's point of view.
Yeah, and that's really what it is. It's about storytelling. When we talk to face and we understand one another's stories, we're not talking about the greater political terms or greater societal meanings of anything. We're talking about my story and your story, and we're sharing about ourselves. And I think even people, I think anyone can open up to a story, and it takes, it can take time and training and understanding of storytelling. But really what we're trying to do is foster that empathy amongst people, to be able to understand where someone's coming from, why they view the world in the way that they do. Not to change your mind per se, but to understand and to learn something. And for long-term or break the divide, there's definitely the climate change aspect of understanding climate change. And there's the truth and reconciliation aspect. And there's the racism aspect. And I think ultimately the goal is to break down these divisions between communities so that we can unite.
And that's a great point. And one evidence which is shocking to all of us is that in this last election in the United States, 80 million people voted for Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. So in spite of all the proofs of his beliefs, his biases, his prejudices, and 80 million people took their time out, went over to the voting booth and voted for him. And not to make this political, but it shows that what I witnessed, what I thought was a train wreck of an administration, somebody that was really tramping on refugee rights, on Muslims, on people of color, Black people, and yet 80 million people voted for him. So it shows in Break the Divide, there is a divide where people literally, they view the world and people like us as something very strange, as we may view them as very strange in their attitude. So breaking that divide and that paradigm is going to be a big challenge.
And these relationships have to be two-way relationships, and we can, other people can say, "Oh, I don't understand you. I don't understand racism." We also have to, and again, this is if you're in the ability and position to do this, we should also take the time to try to understand them and where they're coming from, and that can be difficult. It can be difficult to understand why someone, why someone did something that you don't agree with. Like, why does someone not believe in climate change, or why did someone vote for Trump in your example? And what was the underlying reason? But I think having those conversations is critical. And again, I have no guarantee that that will solve the problems that we see. I have no guarantee that if you talk to a Trump supporter who hates Muslims, for example, that you'll change their mind. But I think we do have the duty to try. And I think until we try, uh, and until we make active efforts to, you know, empathize with those understandings and communities and those experiences, um, we can't we can't say that we can't say that we're doing everything about it, because we need to target the people that are not being reached. We need to target the hardest to reach people. And in conversation, we do that by targeting the people that we disagree with and we don't understand and we don't like. Um, and again, that will be different for every single group, but that's definitely a focus to break the divide moving forward. How do we facilitate that dialogue between groups of people from different backgrounds so that we can unite and break those divides?
And education, awareness, action, but winning the hearts and minds, and
Mhm.
winning the hearts and minds. And it's not even so much as what we say, is how we come out in the world, how we help other people, regardless if they like us, they dislike us.
Absolutely.
And this, what I admire about yourself and your brother and the work that you guys are doing. At a young age, a lot of folks are focused on their career. They're focused on, girls. They're focused on, so many things, video games and pop culture and all that kind of stuff, which, everyone has. But to really give that energy and effort to the environment is so crucial in social justice, because you are the inheritors. Like, the next generation is the inheritors of this world. And if we're not working together now, what kind of world are we leaving for our next generation? And so it's almost like a reverse mentorship, where leaders like yourself are leading the charge, because you physically took a step going to the Arctic, which not many people, the average person is not going to go to the Arctic. So you've taken these steps. And so with these entrenched systems and entrenched belief systems, that people that are, again, on the opposite side of the divide, to reach out to them. And somebody has to cross that divide and reach out. And waiting for other people to reach out and cross the divide is sometimes a long wait. So we have to take that step. And so I admire the fact that you guys are taking that step and breaking the divide and crossing the divide and trying to reach out to like-minded, but minds that may or may not be like-minded, and at least through character, persistence, and hard work, to hopefully win some hearts and minds. And like you brought up, that one starfish, it matters to them. If one person can change, if one person can benefit, then really, that's really what we're trying to do. And I wanted to thank you for your time to join us on this program. And for our viewers and listeners, what would be the takeaways? What would be your messages, core philosophies, beliefs that you would like to impart, and strategies and solutions that you would like for the listeners to come away with, and how they can connect with Break the Divide?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for this wonderful conversation. I think everything from climate change to reconciliation to racism, it's such an important topic. And I think my main takeaway from this conversation for me actually is that connection matters, that empathy matters. And if you're in the position to be able to connect with people who are different than you, if you have that bandwidth, and if you're able to, go ahead and do it and listen with an open mind, be empathetic, and uh, do your best to break the divide. And in terms of connecting with me or Break the Divide, you can find me online at Abhay Sachal. You can find Break the Divide at breakthedivide.net, on all social medias at Break the Divide. We're really looking forward to continuing this work of connecting people. I really do appreciate the work that you're doing here, connecting people with different backgrounds and helping us understand that there is no stranger, that we ought to understand one another, and we ought to come together to address things like racism, to address things like climate change. And I think by uniting, we're able to do all of that in such a powerful way.
Absolutely. And thank you. And looking forward to working with you in the future events and looking forward to our event. And might as well plug our event coming up, which is World Environment Day, June 5th. And Abhay and your brother will speak at our event, amongst other dignitaries from government and academia, to really talk from multiple levels of society how we can address the climate emergency. So thank you again, and we really appreciate you. And everyone can reach breakthedivide.net and be part of the change. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So that's it. So that was good. It was good. It was kind of like talk therapy. Like
that was wonderful. I really enjoyed that conversation.
Because you know what? It's like when we started racism, anti-racism, but then the environment is just almost like, and then the concept of environmental racism. And it's just like whoever's interested in anti-racism is also interested in helping the environment. So it's like there's an intersectional breaking the divide. And just like we call it silo busting. So yeah. Crossing silos, so break the divide is like there are these perceived divides. It's like how many gatherings do we see First Nations, Sikh, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Black, Asian, all together in one forum, rather than one or two groups represented. And so we want to, again, bust some silos, break the divide, as your terminology, and that is our objective, is to cross silos and say that, hey, we're all working together and we all have the same objectives, and it's more powerful if we do it together.
100%. It's a very important work. Again, thank you for the wonderful conversation. It's been great.
Yeah, man. And so we'll see you on June 5th.
Quick question. I don't have the invite for the event. Have you sent the Zoom link already? What time is the event?
The event is 5 to 7 p.m. on the 5th. And then because you guys are on the first day, and then we have a second day, World Oceans Day, which is on the 8th. So Yusuf, maybe because we just finished our speakers packages for our Stop Asian Hate event, which is on Sunday. And so we'll have all that out to you hopefully by early next week, just so you have everything.
It'll be sent out Monday afternoon, probably.
Okay, yeah, no rush at all. Just I think I mixed up my dates. So we're speaking on the 5th.
On June 5th, correct.
5th, perfect. Okay, no, I'm looking forward to it. Oh wow, that's next week. It's very soon.
You know what? Time goes by fast. So awesome. Well, sounds good.
Okay.
Again, yeah, and if you have time, we'll send you the links for the Stop Asian Hate. And we have actually Defense Minister Harjit Sajjan is opening the event, and we have Jenny Kwan, who's an MP. She'll be speaking. We've got Santona, the president of UBC, speaking, and other dignitaries. So we'll send it to you, and if you wouldn't mind pushing it out to your network, that'd be awesome.
Absolutely. No, I would love to be connected. We can definitely work together on these sorts of projects moving forward too. Like I said, we're taking Break the Divide to the next level now with some summer interns for this summer, but hopefully long-term employees to kind of navigate this sort of work. We're doing, like, a bit of a side note here. We're doing like projects around different things, like climate is one. The sports world is one, and religion is another one, like breaking these religious divides, and that sort of interfaith work is also so important.
Which is what we're doing. And we actually connected with the World Sikh Organization, and so that's one group. Another group is